creating a very simple one-layer scene using the Lucky Friend stamp set by Heffy Doodle. And you can see I have all of my masks pre-cut and I'm just kind of lining them up onto my card panel just to make sure that they will fit the way I want them to. And I'm going to bring out my MISTI just to make my stamping a little bit easier. Now this is not a requirement, it just makes things a little easier. This way I can line up all of my masks, including the items or the images that will sit on top or underneath another one, and then I'll line up my stamps. So I'm going to line the stamps up for the images that need to be stamped first. So anything that you want on top of another, you're going to want to stamp first. So I'm going to go ahead and line up those little coins that are in the pot, as well as the coins that are kind of just sitting there, as well as this leprechaun that is also just sitting there, and then the leprechaun that's going to be holding this bag. Line those up right over my masks, remove my masks, and then I'll stamp those onto my card panel. I'm going to be using blackout ink by Ink on 3 because, of course, I'm going to be Copic coloring my images later. This is definitely my favorite ink for Copic coloring, but I know that there's a ton of brands out there that make Copic safe ink, so whatever you choose. So once I have my first layer of stamping done, I'm going to go ahead and mask out all of my images. This is Simon Says Stamp masking paper, which is my favorite masking paper to use, especially when you're doing ink blending over your images, which we will be doing. So I'll go ahead and clean off my stamps, remove those, and I'm going to, at first I was going to use the masks to kind of line up my second row of stamping here, but with the pot of gold, I couldn't see through it naturally. So I ended up using the stamp itself. That way I could line up my little coins there. And for the little bag that he's holding, this is where I should have used the mask because I stamped this way off to the side and his hand is kind of just floating on top of it rather than making it appear as if he's holding it. But it is what it is. Once everything is colored, you don't really notice little errors like that. So I'll go ahead and stamp those out and then again mask those with my masking paper. And for my scene, I want there to be a rainbow coming out of my pot of gold. So I'm taking another piece of the Simon Says Stamp masking paper here and I'm using a die, but you can use anything. And I'm just using this to trace so that I have a curved rainbow. You don't even necessarily need to trace anything, but I can't even cut a straight line, let alone a curved one. So this is just easier for me as a guide as to where I need to cut my mask. So once I had that all traced out and I tried to space them out as evenly as I could, once I had it cut out, I realized that it really wasn't that even, but it was much longer than what I needed it to be. So I was just able to cut off the end that was a little bit skinnier than the other end. And I kind of played around with the placement a little bit before I adhered this down to my card panel. Again, I kind of snipped off any excess that would be hanging beyond that little pot of gold. And then I went ahead and placed that down onto my card panel once I was happy with the placement. And we'll move on to just a little bit of ink blending in the background. And I'm going to be using regular distress inks here because I knew I probably was going to be coloring over them, and I don't necessarily recommend coloring over the oxides. You kind of get muddy mess. So I'm using some blendability brushes. These are by Trinity Stamps, but you can use a regular ink blending tool as well. And I'm just putting a little bit of peeled paint towards the bottom. You'll notice that I'm not doing any masking here as far as any hills or my ground and sky. I'm just going to kind of have both of these fade to white where the ground and the sky would naturally meet. So I was going to use tumbled glass and broken china for my sky, but I ended up just using the broken china. Especially with these type of brushes, you're going to get a very light coat of ink and you kind of build from there. So I didn't necessarily need to go any lighter than the broken china. I'm just concentrating the darkest area being towards the top of my card panel, and then I'm gradually working my way down. I do kind of dab off on my scrap paper before I bring it to my card panel to get at least a majority of the ink off because I want such a light coating of this on my panel. Now, this is personal preference. If you want it to be more bright and vibrant, then I would definitely recommend using an ink blending tool or just keep layering on the color. So once my ink blending was done, I will go ahead and very carefully remove my mask. Just keep in mind that distress ink as well as the oxides stay wet a little bit longer than regular ink, so your masks can tear your paper. So once that was done, I'll go ahead and move on to the Copic coloring, and I have this sped up a little bit more than I normally do because it did take a little bit of time. These are pretty teeny tiny areas. Going to start off with the skin tones for both of these little leprechauns, and this is, if you've ever seen one of my videos, this is not going to be a surprise. This is the typical color combination that I use for skin tones. I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the right side of the leprechaun on the right and to the left side of the leprechaun on the left. I guess I'm just going to use my rainbow as my light source for a majority of the images. So going in with the darkest color, adding that shading underneath their hat, and again off to the right side or left side, depending on which leprechaun it is, adding the two midtones, then going back to that lightest color. I did add a little bit of R20 for their cheeks and then brought back in that E50 just to blend that out a little bit. Next, we'll move on to their hair and their little beards, and I wanted to make them little redheads. So I'm going to start right off with my darkest color, which is typically what I do for hair, and I'm just going to add a little bit of shading underneath their hats and then underneath, I guess in the middle part of their little beards there. Blend that out with the YR18 and then fill in the highlight color, the Y38, just for those remaining areas. Next, we'll move on to their little outfits here. And I ended up using two different green combinations. So for their shirts underneath their jackets, as well as their little stockings, I guess they'd be, I'm going to be using a YG combination, and I'm adding shading to both sides of their shirts because their jackets would be hanging over it. For the leprechaun on the left-hand side, the shading would be off to the left-hand side on his stockings there. For the leprechaun on the right, it would mainly be on the bottom and where his pants are kind of hanging over them because he's sitting that way. So the top part would be the lightest. Now I didn't get a great contrast with this color combination, but once I added the highlight color, it definitely did help. So next, for the rest of their little outfits here, as well as the band on their hat, I'm going to move on to my favorite green combination. And I typically start with the lightest color to map out my darkest areas, but forgot that I still haven't gotten a refill for my G21, so it is really going dry. So I'm actually mapping out my shadow areas with my lightest mid-tone color, and which is fine. It's still easier to cover up than your darkest color, and these areas are going to be covered with that darkest color anyway. So the G24 is my lightest color there. Then I'll go in with the darkest color, then the two midtones, then finally back to that G21. For their hats, I'm doing a little shading on either side because it is a round object. For this particular leprechaun, I'm adding shading underneath his arms and off to the left-hand side on both his pants and his jacket, and also where his jacket and shirt kind of hang over his pants a little bit. For the leprechaun on the right, I'm going to be doing shading where his arms are kind of crossed there, and this is where I realized he should be holding something, and I never stamped anything that he's holding. So, like I said, it is what it is. I'm not going to start over now. Also, his pants, they would have some shading on the bottom because of the way he is sitting. Next, going in with the G46 and extending all of those areas out a little bit further. Then going in with that G24, which is the one that we actually started with. And being I covered up the entire bands of their hats or whatever that's called, I ended up skipping the highlight color for that because I wasn't able to cover up the G21 or the G24 rather. When I go in with the G21, you'll see that I'm not getting the best blend that I normally get with this particular combination. And this is just because my marker's pretty dry. I wouldn't recommend using your marker if it's this dry because you're going to ruin your nib and you might get results like I got. But it's the only option that I had at this point, so it is what it is. I'll change the nib once I actually get the refill for it. So next, moving on to the rest of their hats, I still can't find my black markers, so I'm going to be using some C markers to color their hats, doing shading on either side of the top portion of their hat and the bottom portion, but just leaving a little bit of a highlight on the top part of the little brim of the hat because that would catch the most light. Blending that out with the C5 and then going in with the C3 for my highlight. Colored the other hat the same exact way. For the little shoes, I'm going to be doing some shading on the left-hand side of this little guy's shoes and then on the bottom portion of these shoes because of the way he's sitting. For the cool grays, I typically go right in with my darkest color because they blend so nicely, and the shoes are really, really tiny, and I didn't want my colors to bleed by adding too much ink to the paper. So for the pot of gold, I'm also going to be coloring this black or gray actually. So again, going right in with that darkest color, the C7, I'm going to be adding a little bit of shading underneath the top portion of the pot here and on either side, just varying the lengths of my flicks. By doing this, you will make it appear a little bit shiny. Next, going in with the C5 and just extending those flicks out even further, and also just making that line that we had placed on top for that shadow where the coins are a little bit thicker to extend that shadow out as well. Next, going in with the C3, extending those flicks almost to the very center, just leaving a very small area for my C1, which will be my highlight color. Next, we will move on to the little bag that he's holding. So going in with my lightest color, mapping out the darkest areas. This is also a round object because it looks very full. So I'm going to be doing my shading on either side as well as underneath his little arm and the top portion where the bag is kind of gathered up. Maybe it might be tied together. Where that is tied together, that would also be a little bit darker. Just using a 3-color blend for this, and we'll move on to the coins themselves. Now I'm going to go in right with my darkest color for these as well because they are so teeny tiny. Just going to create a very, very small shadow where one coin is laying over another. And for this stack of coins, I am just going to be adding a little bit of shading on either side, and I'm really just putting one little dot of the E37 for that area, barely touching the tip of my marker to the paper because I don't want these to appear brown once all the coloring is done. So blending all of those areas out with the Y28, which is actually called gold, but to me, it doesn't look very gold. It's kind of a muted gold, but I'm just extending those areas out a little bit further, but not adding too much of this either. When I move on to the Y26, this is where I'm going to really start extending my color because to me, this is more gold than the Y28. And I'm just leaving a little bit of a highlight on the top, mainly the top portion of the coins inside the pot and the middle portion of the coins that are stacked for the Y23. And this will kind of brighten everything up as well. So once I also use the Y26 for this little buckle on their hats, and I didn't do any shading for these because they are so tiny. So next I'm going to be using rainbow colors to create my rainbow. So I dug through my trash and got the mask that I had originally cut for these little coins just because I was too afraid that maybe my marker would slip and I would go over my coins. So I just placed that back on the coins. Keep in mind that this is not going to hold too much ink before it starts bleeding through, but it did protect them enough. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit more, but I'm going to start off with my R35 and just put in where my red portion of the rainbow would be, then move on to the orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. You know how a rainbow goes. And they pretty much will blend together pretty nicely because of the colors that I chose. So even though they're totally different from one another, the last number is either the same or similar to the color that I used before and after. So here I'm using a Y17, and then I'm going to move on to the green color, which is a G07. So they both end in 7. That means they'll blend pretty nicely. You may have to go back to, like for this particular one, I had to go back to that yellow color just to make sure that that green and yellow really blended together. You'll see that the green actually bled a little bit more than any of the other colors, which was really surprising. Usually it's the red that bleeds the most. So here I am with the blue, again going in with the green, making sure that blue and the green kind of fade together pretty nicely. And then finally, I'll finish off with the purple color. Again, that last number is very similar to the color before it. Here I'm just going to kind of lightly go over that green area again with just the tip of my marker to make sure that it doesn't appear that my colors are bleeding too much. So once I was happy with that, I removed my mask and just fixed up those teeny tiny areas that didn't all the way meet those little coins. Going to fix up some of these areas that I kind of went out of the lines with my colorless blender, which is also something that you can go right over regular distress inks with and not so much the oxides. So just using my color chart here to get something that closely matches the peeled paint distress ink or the amount of peeled paint distress ink that I use so that I can create a shadow underneath all of my images. And because my G21, which is the color that would have matched this perfectly, is nearly dry, I brought in a G82 for my lightest color, which is very similar. Starting off with the G46, just creating the darkest portion of each of my shadows, then blending that out with the G24. And when I blend out the shadows, I blend on either side and a little bit down. I usually don't blend out my shadows going up unless it's like this little leprechaun that's sitting down. I may blend that up a little bit because the rest of his body is higher than his little feet. So once I had that shadow done, I went ahead and added some shimmer with a wink of Stella over my little coins. And then I will take a white gel pen just to add some reflections to pretty much everything. I started with the pot of gold and added a reflection on either side. And then I added some reflections to the right-hand side of the leprechaun on the right and the left-hand side for the leprechaun on the left. Next, we'll move on to the sentiment, and there's a couple different options that you have here to kind of mix and match to make your own little sentiment here. So I'm going to start off with the word lucky and kind of build around that. So I'll stamp that first. Sometimes I line up all of my little sentiment strips together, and other times I will stamp them individually. I'm going to be stamping with black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. Went ahead and stamped that lucky, and then I'll kind of build around that. So I stamped the I am right above it, kind of off to the left, so it kind of tucked right in to that word. And then the rest of my sentiment, I line that up, make sure that it is straight before putting it on your acrylic black. Went ahead and stamped that out, and then ended up adding even more shimmer to that entire rainbow. I felt like I needed even more shimmer to this card. But that is it for today, guys. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.